Imagine standing in a freezing, mud-soaked jungle 11,000 miles from home. The sky is black, a savage monsoon rain is blinding you, and the ground beneath your feet is violently shaking. Suddenly, through the midnight fog, a massive, armor-clad monster charges directly at you. It picks up your closest friend with its trunk, hurls him through the air like a rag doll, and crushes his bronze armor into the mud like glass. This was the horrific reality for the army of Alexander the Great. History books tell you he was an unstoppable god who conquered the entire known world without ever losing a single battle. But history books omit the darkest chapter. Deep in the jungles of ancient India, the world's most elite military force ran into a psychological nightmare so devastating, it did what no empire on earth could ever accomplish. It broke their iron will forever. The year was 326 B.C. Alexander had marched his men across scorching deserts and frozen mountain peaks, crushing the massive Persian Empire and swallowing kingdoms whole. But on the edge of the earth, he hit a definitive brick wall, the mighty Hydaspes River. The waters were a churning, roaring death trap, and waiting on the exact opposite bank was King Porus, leading an army flanked by 200 massive war elephants. To the Western soldiers, these were not just animals. They were living, breathing tanks. Their tusks were tipped with razor-sharp steel blades, and their roars alone sent Alexander's legendary war horses into a blind panic. Attempting a direct crossing meant absolute suicide. Your men would drown or be instantly slaughtered the second they touched the mud. The world's greatest conqueror was completely trapped. So, how do you defeat an army you cannot even reach? Alexander didn't use muscle. He used a deadly, exhausting psychological lie that pushed the defenders to the brink of insanity. For weeks, Alexander played a brutal mental game with the Indian army. Every single night, under the pitch-black cover of the monsoon, he ordered his massive cavalry units to march up and down the riverbank. They beat giant war drums, blew war horns, lit massive fires, and screamed terrifying war cries into the night. At first, King Porus responded exactly as expected. He mobilized his terrifying elephants and rushed them to the bank, bracing for a bloody midnight invasion. But night after night, nothing happened. It was entirely fake. It was psychological torture. Weeks passed. The Indian soldiers grew completely exhausted from sleep deprivation, constant false alarms, and the grueling mud. Eventually, King Porus fell into the trap. He assumed Alexander was a coward who was all noise and no action. He ordered his main army to stay in their tents, leaving only a few tired guards on the riverbank. Did the Indian king just make the most fatal mistake in ancient history, or was he lured into something far worse? Alexander was waiting for this exact moment of complacency. On a night when the monsoon storm reached a terrifying peak, with rain pouring in blinding sheets and thunder deafening enough to mask the sounds of an army, Alexander moved. He left a decoy force at the main camp to keep making noise, completely blinding Porus's scouts. Meanwhile, Alexander took 15,000 elite killers and slipped into the dark jungle. Their destination was 17 miles upriver. But what waited for them in the roaring currents almost ended the empire before the battle even began. 17 miles away from the main camp, Alexander's elite strike force stood before a raging, swollen river. In the pitch black, illuminated only by flashes of lightning, they began crossing on makeshift rafts and stuffed skins. The violent currents dragged men and horses down into the deep. One wrong slip meant drowning silently in the dark. By the time the morning sun broke through the storm clouds, the impossible was done. Alexander the Great was across the river. But the surprise was short-lived. King Porus realized he had been brilliantly outflanked, spun his army around, and deployed his ultimate weapon directly in the center. 200 war elephants stepped forward, forming a towering wall of flesh and iron. Wooden towers were strapped to their backs, packed with elite archers raining arrows from above. Alexander, completely confident, ordered his legendary companion cavalry to charge the flanks. But the moment they closed the distance, absolute disaster struck. The elite Macedonian horses completely lost their minds. The terrifying sight, the deafening trumpeting, and the strange, pungent smell of the elephants sent the horses into a blind frenzy. They reared up, threw their riders, and bolted. Alexander's entire tactical system relied on his cavalry. In a matter of seconds, his greatest weapon was rendered completely useless. With his horses paralyzed by fear and his lines starting to waver, Alexander was forced to make a desperate, terrifying choice. Send his infantry directly into the meat grinder, or face total annihilation. With no cavalry support, Alexander ordered the legendary Macedonian phalanx forward. Thousands of men, locked shield to shield, stepped directly into the path of the charging monsters. The clash was an absolute bloodbath. The elephants crashed into the tight lines like moving mountains. They impaled soldiers on their steel-tipped tusks, trampled men into the deep mud, and ripped infantry straight out of formation with their trunks. The long Macedonian spears, which had shattered every army in the civilized world, simply snapped like twigs against the thick, armored hides of the beasts. For the first time in their lives, Alexander's veteran soldiers were screaming in pure psychological horror. The battlefield turned into a swamp of blood, severed limbs, and mud. The Macedonian lines were fracturing. Men were turning to run. The undefeated empire was minutes away from being completely wiped off the map. Alexander was surrounded, his men were dying, and his tactical genius seemed completely useless against raw, monstrous power. Could the man who conquered the world pull off a miracle in the next 3 minutes? Or was this the exact moment the legend of Alexander the Great was destined to die in the mud? Watching his unstoppable army break, Alexander adapted with savage precision. He ordered his specialized light infantry, the elite javelin throwers, to ignore the enemy soldiers entirely. He gave them one brutal, terrifying command: blind the monsters. The light infantry swarmed the raging beasts like hornets. They ignored the trampling feet and rained javelins, arrows, and specialized axes directly into the elephants' eyes and trunks. At the same time, they targeted the drivers on their necks, leaving the giant animals completely leaderless. The tactical shift turned the battle into a living hell. Blinded, bleeding from hundreds of deep wounds, and completely panicked, the elephants went completely insane. They thrashed wildly, turned around, and stampeded backward. They plowed directly into their own advancing Indian infantry, crushing and trampling thousands of their own men in a chaotic frenzy of agony. Seizing the absolute chaos, Alexander rallied his scattered cavalry, charged around the stampede, and completely surrounded King Porus's army. The brutal slaughter lasted for 8 grueling hours. Thousands lay dead. Alexander won the battle, but it was a completely hollow victory. The psychological horror of the war elephants and the endless monsoon had completely broken his army's iron spirit. Days later, when Alexander ordered them to march deeper into India to face even larger elephant armies, his men flatly refused. They mutinied. The world's greatest conqueror was forced to turn back because his own men were too terrified to take another step. If you were standing in that bloody mud, knowing thousands more monsters were waiting in the deep jungle? Would you have pushed forward for eternal glory, or would you have demanded to go home too? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe to Loreify for more untold history.